too long, share a few thoughts with you. And one of the disadvantages of doing this in person is that you cannot play it on double speed. We can actually listen on double speed, but we can only speak on single speed. So when we move from digital to in-person, that's one of the disadvantages. I'm going to start out, pick up on the great, so the session that I was going to follow originally, which was Zeal's session, and there was a few things that I picked up there, and I thought she made my thesis quite well, what I wanted to say. I just wanted to draw it out, but it was all there. And she drew the contrast between facing failure and succeeding, being successful. And so to do the contrast, if you're facing failure, then there's only one direction you can go. So that's there's a sense of liberation there, because the worst is kind of, you face the worst, it can only get better. And success is tricky because you can go in two directions, right? It can get worse and you want to get it better. So that creates nervousness and makes people conservative, want to protect things. I want to switch the language a little bit and draw the contrast between a beginning and an end. So where she was talking about failure, I want to talk about beginnings. One of the things about beginnings is there's only one direction. What's behind you when you're beginning something is there's nothing, right? Because you're beginning. So there's only one way you can go. And when you worry about success and you're trying to preserve it, the best way to make success, or to preserve success, is to make an end. And when you lock it in. And so one of the things I want to spend time unpacking is, how do we make the transition from an end to beginning? Or how do we make an end in order to make a beginning? Or to make a beginning, well, we have to make an end. And anyway, so this is all. There's a famous quote that I'm not going to get into. So we spend the day celebrating founders, and I think they're quite fascinating. They have the conviction and resilience to make an imaginary future real. And that's something fascinating. And it's fascinating because of the dareness, they're daring in that sense. And if they had to run an ad to hire people for the journey, bring people along, they couldn't do better than the legendary ad. This is what Ernest Shackleton is said to have placed in the newspaper, to recruit men for his journey to cross the Antarctic. And a few things there just stand out for me. Small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness. I think that captures it quite well. And at the same time, it's quite attractive. And if we think about Ernest Shackleton's journey, it was obviously very challenging, but it was a journey with a pre-charted course. The course was pre-charted. It was just a difficult thing to do. Now, founders go on a journey that has an uncharted route and has an uncertain and often unknown destination. And in fact, EntreConf's tagline says it all: the future is unwritten. So they're trying to write the unwritten. So we have two journeys, and in both cases, it's about endurance. It's about physical and mental endurance. And what that endurance is about is preserving hope. But in one case, what we're preserving is the hope of keeping something that already is, the hope of maintaining life, surviving in the cold and the ice, the overwhelming ice. In the second case, for founders and entrepreneurs, it's the hope of creating something, and that's the difference between the two. Now, founders, entrepreneurs, are not unique in their quest to create. In fact, they share the creative spirit with lots of other roles in society that are to do with creating things. So, and a founder, an entrepreneur, goes through all of these roles as part of their journey. So when they formulate visions, they are designers. When they seek to understand markets and trends, they're scientists. When they have to solve problems, they're engineers. And we have to create utility, they're designers. Designers in the sense that having a compelling offering and a sustainable venture. At the same time, when we think about entrepreneurs, we could actually say we can't identify or define entrepreneurs just by looking at people, right? Entrepreneurship, being an entrepreneur, is not about who people are. It's not about what they do. And if we had to pick up some defining things, I would settle on two. One is about orientation. So this is always about, it's an orientation towards the future and the dareness to want the future to be different from the present. But with that also comes attitude. And these two things define the meaning, but to being an entrepreneur is about the meaning of what you do. And that meaning comes from the inside. And the second bit is about attitude. And this has to do with how we think in different situations, all in this quest to make a difference. So with all that said, when we talk about entrepreneurial success, it's very interesting to talk about another journey. And it is a journey from founder to CEO. And that's what comes with success. And I think that came out very clearly in some of the things that Zeal was saying. So what this is about, we're moving from this quest to create something, moving towards being custodians of an already working organization. In fact, very often entrepreneurs describe their ventures as children. This is a very, very persistent metaphor. But what we have here with the CEO role is we have a child that is now grown up, independent, and has its own interests. And one of the things that we recognize is that one of the hallmarks of entrepreneurial success is the founder's ability to step away from the business, to take a holiday, and for the business to be still running. Because very often that is not possible. And when you're able to do that, that means that the business is there, success is there because the business can run on its own. And of course that creates a challenge, because when you're away from the business, it feels like an empty nester. The kids have kind of grown up, they're independent, they moved away, and now what do you do? And when you're in the business, you begin to worry about where is that spirit, where is that spark that we had at the beginning, where is that vitality of trying to make something work, to create something work, because the business has its own interests. And of course with that comes there's a changing motivation for what happens. At the beginning, it all comes from the inside, which is the desire to create. With an established organization, with an established business, a lot of the motivation to do things comes from the outside. It's to defend our turf. It's to outcompete. It's to grow for the sake of growth and for the sake of outgrowing competitors. So it's not an internal, it's an externally driven motivation. And so when we think about a business we can actually think about a business as a life form. This is a case where size actually counteracts the zeal. Why? Because when we have a working organization, it's like we can call it alive simply because it wants to survive. That's what an organization then becomes. What a life form is something that wants to survive. And this is what a great physicist, Schrödinger, about 100 years ago, said. Life feeds on what he calls negative entropy. It creates this order and keeps the order and tries to isolate itself from the disorder outside. And that's one of the reasons when we want to change organizations, there's so much resistance, because they want to keep the way things are. This is just a natural thing when an organization arises. So we could say, and it becomes this well-oiled, well-geared machine, not only to survive, but to achieve whatever purpose is being set in front of it. It's just there to keep that going. So we could say that when you're successful as an entrepreneur, your imagined future has now become the future, right? It's now become real. But when that happens, something is lost. And I think it's very, very interesting to think about what Henry Bergson reminds us, that there is actually more charm in hope than in possession. It's when we're hopeful, this is the charming bit. When we achieve, when we're successful, something is being lost. So we could say that the zeal disappears when we succeed. And in that case, you could say that founder becomes a badge, and it's no longer a state of mind. It is a badge. So what do we do? How do we keep that zeal going? Well, there's a couple of obvious things. One is to retreat perhaps from the requirements, the custodial requirements, administrative requirements that have been. They say, actually, let me go back to wanting to create things. What is that? What was that creative things that really motivated me in the first place? And we could retrieve around the things that we love out of those creative roles. So we could be, maybe I like discovery and explanation, understanding. So I will take the roles that has to do with where I'm more like a scientist. Or I really like efficiencies and solving problems, and I could retreat in roles that is more about engineering. Or I like delighting people and creating that utility, and that's the designer role. Or I look for new meaning and new visions, and that's going to be the artist's route. So this is to find a niche and to maintain that. We can also take a spin-off venture and lead that and almost try to go to the journey anew, and this will be a way of engaging in all those four roles. Or we can try and draw an end, sell and move on, and perhaps start again. But more broadly, I want to end with, and this comes from Nietzsche and his definition of the metamorphosis of that people go through. So when we go through life, we start out as camels. And as camels, we get loaded up with the burden of things that carry the message, you shall. So think about all the expectations, requirements, and all these things that we learn about everything that we shall be doing. These are the norms we have to comply with. And then there comes a point where camels becomes lions. And what lions do is they rebel. They go from hearing you shall, they go to I will. And in fact, the original founding spirit and the first ventures we get started, they have this rebellious feel to them. So it's a rebel, I will, and we create something. And when that succeeds, there's a danger again that organization starts loading up you shall upon us. And so there's a danger that we might retreat back to camels. And this is the critical point where what is the next stage in that transition? So from lion, we become child. What is a child? A child is curious, a child is forgetful, and a child always seeks a new beginning. Thank you.
Dimo, should we sit over here? Do you want to grab that mic? So I don't know, we've got Schrödinger, we've got Nietzsche, we've got camels, we've got lions, we've got just a conceptual overload going on there that I wanted to explore a few points here, which is, I want to come to, it may be slightly more prosaic, but I want to talk about the nature of zeal, the founding spirit, the sense of hope, and the degree to which that is mitigated through that scale, that you start as having that incredible specialism, that desire, that focus, but as it builds, you as a business owner actually have to build the skill across the piece and be aware of it, and so you actually come away from your specialism. How can you mitigate that? Isn't it inevitable that you end up working on the business rather than in the business as a business scales?
Perhaps it is. I mean, there are. I mean, you've mentioned the few ideas that I threw in, but they're the smarter people, scientists who have studied actually growth, the growth in nature, and they've translated that to growth of organizations, to growth of societies and cities, and all these organisms that look like all these things where we have scaling. And one of the things that comes with scaling, you have to change the structure of things. That's inevitable to the things that you. One of the things we do know is that at larger scales in nature, life slows down. So it's inevitable that at larger scales we have this slowdown process, this administration and all these things. Is it always? Is it really inevitable? Right? Perhaps not. But
So maybe part of it is what Zilla was gesturing towards, which is a form of humility, which says that you are, as entrepreneurs, you are excellent about in the thing that you're excellent at, but you bring in other resources, other capabilities, so that you can continue to focus. It's almost the arc for some entrepreneurs ought to be exactly to become the creative Imagineers, which some entrepreneurs take as a type of job title when they've done with the growing thing. Is that a sort of a sensible way to think about it? Be excellent at the thing you're excellent at, and just bring in the rest elsewhere. You don't have to do everything.
I would agree. I mean, this funded business is one of the conversations that comes early on is whether the founder would become the CEO down the line. And very often you have that someone else is brought in to take the CEO role, and the founder retreats to the things that they love doing.
And right the way back at the beginning, we had Graham McVoy talking about selling the concept, this blank sheet of paper approach, and so on. And so his role became advocate for the business, spokesman almost for the business, but not actually at that stage within it. So those sort of skills are quite different, being an advocate as opposed to driving what you're great at. How do you propose that entrepreneurs combine those two roles as the front person as well as the driver?
lots of reflection, personal development, and try to be very deliberate about understanding the roles and when you have to step in one and another. So this is quite a lot of discipline and self-thought and development.
So
Yeah, it's not a natural thing.
So much of entrepreneurialism actually involutes right way back to self, which is self-knowledge, self-understanding. What are your motivations? What are your capabilities? Can I just throw it open at this point? A couple of questions for Dimo about, and for those perhaps who've experienced this point, your sense of, you mentioned a lot about hope and travelling in hope, and you can argue the Shackleton thing was exactly travelling in hope, but you travel, you believe, you're on that journey, but how do you maintain that belief as you're running businesses? Anyone like to comment on that as a point? Yeah, Ursula at the front, and we'll take Dave afterwards if that's okay. So let's have this.
Hi, I believe that...
Is that mic working? 1, 2, 3?
1, 2, 3?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, it is, yeah, good.
So, Ursula Morgan, I've just spent the last 13 years in the States. Thanks to Future Publishing, I moved out there in 2010 and then left them to work in the startup community in San Francisco. I believe that resilience, Greg, we all run low on fuel, and Zilla mentioned that as well, and how do you keep refueling yourself? But I do believe that you do need to have somebody that you can go to when you're pushing that boulder up the hill, but also as entrepreneurs, we're all moving in communities, and we can see when somebody's struggling and see when that boulder seems a bit large. And I think that's what we all need, is somebody that we can go to and go, we're having a bad day, or somebody to recognize and go, hey, you're having a bad day, but you're doing a really good job. And do you realize you've just achieved this, this, and this? I think that's one of the big things, just remembering that.
I think you also have to be slightly careful about the metaphor of pushing a boulder up the hill, because that's a Sisyphean task and it rolls back on you, doesn't it? Does that mean
Still find meaning, though.
you still find meaning in process, yeah.
I think we're all pushing it up the hill, but
Yeah.
we have help and somebody helping us push that boulder up the hill. I think that's what I'm going at.
So the need for help, support.
Just to add to that, so that's the emotional ability, the part of the endurance, and sometimes we forget that we're actually physical bodies, because with so much conceptual and hope, these are all elevating concepts, and we can go after that, and we can try and really persevere in that direction. We tend to forget we're actually physical bodies, and this is where we have to think about well-being and simple things, sleep, recovery, and just taking off mind and doing other things. And so the body needs to. We don't have the luxury of rebooting the way we reboot a computer, because the computer gets stuck. You just reboot, and it's alive again. It's like it started. It's a new beginning. How do we do that in our place? It's a tricky one. Again, new beginnings.
Couple of points. You made the point that children in some ways are better at that than adults are, and Zilla very much made the point about the value of sleep and health. Dave, I think you had a question. Do you have a mic? Yeah.
I do, yeah. It's on. There we go. Dimo, thank you ever so much for that. There's a lot in there that I could identify with. I think one thing that I certainly recognise in founders that I spend time with and work with is the ones that seem to keep their zeal, come back to and reassess their personal why and their personal purpose, which some may feel should stay the same, whereas actually the successful entrepreneurs seem to be perfectly happy if that changes over time. So I was wondering whether or not, if you agree with that statement, well, if you don't agree with that statement, I'd love to understand why. But if you do agree with that statement, I wonder if you could talk to either the methods, the techniques, or the environment that people could find themselves in that'll help them to reconsider and re-understand their personal purpose and why as they move through that journey.
I very much agree with the statement, and I'm bad at quoting, but I think it was another of those very aphoristic Nietzschean thoughts. But it was said, I would much rather have the void as a purpose than the absence of purpose. Then kind of purpose is a void. There's the idea of why versus, it doesn't matter what the why is as long as there is a why. Right, so we don't have to be attached to the specific, but to the idea of the why, and that's where hope and purpose and zeal, that's where these things are related to, which is always about a beginning. There's always a direction towards something that's future.
I'll bring in David in a second. I just want to ask, there's a phrase used when we were chatting out this session before, which is a Jeff Bezos quote, which is from his shareholder letter in 96 or 97?
97,
yeah. 97, very early on. about why, in his mind, in his world, it's always day one for Amazon, and the absolute difference in day one and day two. Can you just unpack that area?
So every year he would include that letter from '97, and he would just improvise and riff off it. But the message was, it was always day one. In fact, their main building was called Day One. When Amazon moved to a bigger building, they still call it Day One. And he calls Day One, he calls it the vitality stage. Day One is about vitality and freshness, and always being customer focused and the speed of decision making. And he says, don't manage by proxies, where you talk to customers rather than looking at customer survey results. Don't look at 80% of customers, actually speak to them. So this is, don't let processes take over. That's what Day One is. And he calls day two, he calls a slow death and stasis. And he says, as soon as we get to Day Two, then that might as well be the end of it. And so in his mind is always, how do you keep being always in Day One? And these are the principles.
I've actually got the quote. The Day Two quote is particularly powerful. Day One is essentially hunting new opportunities, keeping to your focus, what you are. Day Two is stasis, followed by irrelevance, followed by excruciating, painful decline. Wait for this, followed by death. And that is why it is always Day One. And I think that sort of arc, that sense of, he had that sense, and being able to, they're well worth Googling and reading those pieces, those keynote addresses to shareholders, and the sense of how his thinking developed over that. But actually, how his thinking was so formed so early for a business that, back to the very beginning of this, didn't even exist. David, Lester, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I guess I'm going to talk about keeping that zeal on the way to your first end. I think we all, as entrepreneurs, define our own success. What does that look like to us? And I've been there myself a lot of time, where it's rare that success comes easily or quickly. Almost always takes longer and more money and so on than we expect. For me, on that part of the journey, it's third-party validation. That might be happy customers, it might be other things, but you've got to have third-party validation of data that says, yes, you are on the right track. Otherwise, if you don't have that, then it's pretty soul-destroying and very hard to maintain that vision, that belief. And I think if you read Dyson, his original biography, he had enough third-party validation, despite lots of setbacks, that he knew he was on the right track. Despite it's a long old story. Phenomenal results, but you've got to have something that's outside of yourself to push you on, I think.
I would agree with that. As ever, there's always a continuum, and we have to avoid the end. So one end would be you just do hope and dream and never seek third-party validation, and the other end is you're only driven by third-party validation. So there's nothing really you stand for, and you just go in whatever direction customers take you, because they say I want this and I want that. And that's also an extreme that we want to avoid. It's always in the middle. We gotta navigate that in between.
Forgive me if this seems a bit cheesy, but we've heard this, and so I just want to replay it back. That point about third-party validation. We think in business, what defines our success? It's, I don't know, conventionally hitting a budget or something, or doing some cool, great new thing, or things that people like. Or yes, if you've got external metrics, or people saying it's really good. I do think, and I'm struggling here, but I'm trying to be objective, I do think the process of entering and winning awards and having that validation from judges, it says, you know what, well, bloody hell, perhaps we are. And the sense of encouragement that's brought, we've had people refer that back to us, and I know that's true of many others. I hesitate because it's a cheesy point, but I actually do think there's truth in that validation. We all need some form of validation. It might also come from our partners, our friends, our staff, our team, or whatever. But it's so important to buoy you up.
So very quickly, so I think just to build on what you just said, so that's a way of breaking this uncharted long journey. If you break it into milestones, and one way of making a new beginning is to hit a milestone, to get the award.
Yeah.
And that allows you to say, okay, now we've secured a landing here, and we can start building again. And so when you fall, you don't fall back all the way to the bottom. You build up some steps too. So you set new beginning by hitting milestones and just taking that bigger chunk, complex things into smaller.
Do you know that?
Small wins, they call them.
Small wins. It almost sounds like gamifying business. I mean, who would have thought that of a concept?
Yeah,
Yes, absolutely. We'll come to Gary in a moment. Did you have a hand up earlier? Yes. Could we have a mic to the second row, please? Thanks. And then I'll take Gary subsequently. Can we just check the mics on?
Yeah.
1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Or,
Hello?
yes,
That's it.
very good.
Noreen Finnemore. And I just wonder whether another way of actually keeping your founding zeal after many years in business is actually stepping out of it sometimes for a period and doing something completely different, whether that's a course at the University of Bath or something academic, learning a new language, or something more related to the business. I guess it's also the other part of making sure you get enough sleep and all the physical things. It's some new mental stimulation that you can then bring back to the business again afterwards.
I fully agree. So the more immediate in my part of my role as an academic perhaps it's all about creating, but sometimes it has more in common with the difficulties of writers. So we create, but we sell ideas as academics. So there's the process of writing something that's going to resonate. And of course you get stuck, and when you get stuck, I find that it's always nice to step away, and sometimes you put it away for a month. And when you come back and just read it again, you start again, and it's so fresh. I can't believe I was thinking that a month ago, because I have all these new things that I can make it so much better. And it's just the process of stepping away and learning. When you find that moment comes, you really actually that's the moment to step away rather than to stay in and be really, really frustrated. And then with that comes quite a lot of other negative things. It's as simple as that. Stepping away, doing other things. You come back to it. It's always new, and that's back to this idea of a new beginning. And it's
And just that point about academic courses, and again, I'm slightly hesitating because of University of Bath, but it seems to me the prospect of doing an MBA, or as Zilla talked about, a degree in behavioural psychology, I think she was saying, it is a refresher, it's a stand back, it's a perspective that's gained. Gary.
Hi, Gary Fisher from MoConsult. So we're in construction, and we've only been going 4.5 years, so it's important to us about setting the right culture. I think keywords like transparency, failing forward, it's quite a catchphrase that we're trying to use going as we build the company moving forward. Have you got any advice for setting the culture to be a positive culture? Because I've worked in large corporates where there's someone's mentioned it already about toxicity, that sort of thing. How can we? Obviously, I've seen it and I want to go away from it, but is there any way of emphasizing the positives as we move forward as a business?
I think Dave said it well earlier in the collaboration setting. What is it? Promote what you permit, and reward what you reinforce what you reward. Yeah. So that these are some of the elements. I mean, positive is people want to thrive. People want to do autonomy is one of the autonomy, mastery, and purpose. These are the three things that we know drives us as humans. And so very simply, you can think, how can we instill these things in the culture that we have? On the failing forward, that's quite a buzzword in a way. But since we talked about Jeff Bezos earlier, one of the ideas I like is the difference between reversible and irreversible decisions. When we recognize if there's an irreversible decision, it's not something you play with. It's not something that I'm going to fail fast there because I'm committing myself to things that I cannot reverse. If something is reversible, then there's no problem. You can just move and play. And so that would be the idea of failing forward, in a sense, of things that you can easily correct and reverse. But there's some major decisions where you have to actually think very carefully and build up the knowledge. Make sure you know before you commit. I found that as a useful. One is know before you do, and the other one is do before you know, in a way.
There's a very wise line from Marcel Proust, I think you mentioned when we chatted about not seeking new lands, but having new eyes.
Yeah.
That sense of it's almost to Noreen's point, you don't necessarily have to, it's gaining perspective on what you do and keeping a very close eye on being fresh. One last thought, let's have a look at this. One last thought really. VCs must be alive to this. Any investor looking at a business must be alive to the idea that a founder sort of potentially runs out of steam or loses focus on the thing that matters. How far do you think term sheets do or don't reflect that sense of importance of keeping entrepreneurs hungry in terms of their focus on the business?
Well, they do, and they if there's one principle to all term sheets is that in a way the entrepreneur always eats last. If you use that expression, that's always the way they're loaded up. And then when you have multiple rounds, you have multiple investors, and the later investors want to eat before the earlier ones, and the earlier ones want to eat before. So the entrepreneur is always at the end. There's a danger of pushing this so far towards the other extreme, is that they just become, because at the end of the day, the value of the whole thing depends on the effort that the entrepreneur is going to put in. And so that sometimes investors have to realize that. So you have, liquidation preferences, anti-dilution preferences, all designed to leave the entrepreneur, to make the investor whole in a way and compensate for things, but the entrepreneur always gets last. And you can really push it to the point where they can say, well, you know what, I'm just going to walk away, and then the whole thing crumbles. So it's a very delicate edifice.
Dimo, I think you've given us huge stimulation. I'm sorry to have we had to bounce the session because we had a couple of people need to go. But I do think the insights, the quality of thinking, it's a perfect example of the application of academic thinking in a business, in an entrepreneurial context. Please, I would absolutely stress, have a check out on EntreConf's YouTube channel, the two previous talks you've given at EntreConf. But on behalf of us all, to Dimo Dimov, thank you so much for talking. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.